In the autumn of 1529, a huge Turkish army laid siege to Vienna. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had proclaimed a jihad, a holy war. 20,000 Viennese citizens were trapped. Within the city walls, fear and despair were widespread. If Vienna fell, it seemed, then the rest of Europe too was no longer safe. In the early 16th century, Vienna was one of the biggest German cities. It lay only 150 kilometers from the western border of the Ottoman Empire. In May 1529, a messenger brought the news that a huge army had set out from Istanbul to lay siege to Vienna and capture the city. Among its frightened inhabitants was Peter Stern von Labbach, the Austrian Secretary of War. "If there is a battle, I shall not be able to fight. My eyes are too weak, my bones too fragile. So day after day I shall do my duty and record the fate of Vienna in the greatest of detail." Vienna, a city on the periphery of an empire that owed its power and its wealth to the sea. Whoever held dominion over the waves also held sway over the trade routes. Europe was proceeding to subjugate America, the New World. The monarch of this realm was Charles V. He ruled an empire on which it was said the sun never set. In Europe, Charles V was in conflict with the Ottoman Empire over dominance in the Mediterranean and in the Balkans. Even in those days, a power political dispute was stylized into a conflict between cultures, Christianity versus Islam. The siege of Vienna was part of this conflict. As Secretary of War in the service of the Habsburgs, Peter Stern wrote the official chronicle of the defense of Vienna, a unique document. In the year of our Lord 1529, Sultan Suleiman, the cruel tyrant and sworn enemy of the Christian faith, set out for Vienna with all his military equipment and forces in order to defeat Christianity and subjugate it. In his chronicle, Peter Stern describes the threat emanating from the Ottoman Empire. A vast domain that stretched from the Balkans to North Africa, and in its organization was far more advanced than any European state.
One imagines that on the ground it must have worked pretty well. People could petition, they could write petitions to the Sultan, and you read in the record books that such and such had, people were named in these. Some villager in some small village in Anatolia, for instance, is named in these registers. He's asked for such and such a favor, or that some crime has been committed, but particular people are singled out from Istanbul to have justice done either in their name or against them. So the tentacles of the state, central state, did reach very far.
Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire and the seat of its ruler, Suleiman the Magnificent. He had the same desire for expansion as Charles V. Thus, like Charles V, he too declared the war to be a conflict between the world religions. Suleiman proclaimed a jihad, a holy war.
One has to remember, of course, that the sultans did not see themselves, for instance, as the caliphs of Islam. That was one of their titles, but it wasn't one that was sort of promoted as their first and foremost title. First and foremost, they were a sultan. So, in the way that this title of caliph was there as a rhetorical device, so would have been a proclamation of jihad, to rally the troops, to give them a focus for the fight, and so on. I think it was, it's a territorial confrontation. It's not, first and foremost, a religious confrontation with Ferdinand and with the Habsburgs.
In May 1529, the 150,000-man Ottoman Empire set out for Vienna. Its first major encampment was at Belgrade. But the march was arduous. Unusually heavy rain had softened the ground, and the heavy guns had to be left behind. The Ottoman army sank in the mud. In most regions, the downpours had destroyed almost the entire harvest. The price of grain had risen 20-fold. One of the Sultan's secretaries recorded events in a journal. It rained so heavily that many people drowned in the river. Some of the horses and camels were swept away by the water. Men climbed up trees and spent 2 days and nights there. The account by the Ottoman secretary is the only Turkish eyewitness report of the campaign against Vienna, and it exists solely in a copy that does not reveal the name of its author. But it must have been someone who experienced the campaign in close proximity to the Sultan, someone who, like Peter Stern, had been officially commissioned to write his account. He describes the hardships of the Turkish advance in great detail.
The rivers themselves, even on a good year, were not within the channels we see today. The place had not been drained. There were swamps, marshes everywhere. The Ottomans had to negotiate these. They could follow the lines of the rivers. They had to cross the rivers. Crossing rivers was always a huge problem for any army. For the Ottoman army, we read in the chronicles all through the time that they were marching up to the European front, of the great difficulties they had crossing rivers.
The advance of the Turkish army was a superb logistical achievement. After covering nearly 2,000 kilometers in 4 months, despite all the adversities it had faced, the Turkish army was just outside Vienna, and fear had preceded it. At the last minute, the inhabitants of Vienna tried to flee. They did not believe the town could be held. Only 400 citizens capable of bearing arms stayed behind. In the van of the Turkish army were the Akinci, light horse troops who appeared outside the city for the first time on September the 21st. Raping and pillaging, they razed everything to the ground. Many refugees from Vienna also fell into their hands. The women and children were captured and handed over to the Turkish army as slaves. Most of the men were decapitated without further ado, and their heads stuck on poles as trophies. Our warriors forced their way into a farmstead. Sounding the Muslim battle cry, they drew their sabers and cut down all the infidels. They seized the girls and boys and secured rich booty. This too is further proof of the grace of Allah. The people of Vienna hoped for help, but Charles V was unable to come in person because at the time he was at war with France. However, at the last minute, he sent 17,000 Landsknechts to defend the city. It meant there were now more soldiers in Vienna than citizens. Landsknechts were professional soldiers who risked their lives for money. Their manners were coarse, their behavior boastful. Even their clothing expressed contempt for social barriers.
The first thing that was provocative, of course, was the large amount of material used for their clothing. They wanted to show how much money they had. In fact, they squandered their money as fast as they could earn it. Also provocative were their broad shoulders. Having broad shoulders and a slender waist was typical of the Landsknechts. They wanted to show, of course, that they were an elite force who could afford everything and who had no need to observe social barriers.
The most provocative piece of a Landsknecht's clothing was his codpiece, a replica of an erect penis, and a symbol of constant virility.
It was used for all sorts of things, even as a purse. Occasionally, it could be quite amusing to march into a town and then get your coins out of your codpiece.
In order to pay the 17,000 Landsknechts, Vienna's church treasures were melted down and emergency coins struck. On September the 24th, 1529, 3 days after the Akinci, the main Ottoman army reached Vienna. Surrounded by 150,000 Turks, the city was cut off. Suleiman hoped the display of oriental splendor and the sheer size of his army would intimidate the people of Vienna and persuade them to surrender without a fight. To the commander and the other inhabitants of the fortress of Vienna, let it be known that if you become Muslims, nothing will happen to you. But if you offer resistance, then, by Allah the Most Sublime, your city will be reduced to ashes and young and old slaughtered. Suleiman had no interest in storming the city, because according to Islamic martial law, he would have to grant his troops 3 days of pillage. Only if Vienna capitulated would all its treasures belong to him. So, with this in mind, he dispatched 4 prisoners to the city with a message. The message was a demand to capitulate. Only then would the city be spared. Suleiman is thus trying to strike an agreement with the leaders of our city. He vows not to let any of his men enter it and do harm to its people. But if we do not surrender, he will not stop until he has conquered Vienna and slaughtered young and old. But capitulation was out of the question. The siege began with a show of arms. When it came to discipline and skill at arms, there was scarcely an army in Europe that could compete with the Turks. The vast Ottoman camp. It could only be seen in its entirety from the spire of St. Stephen's Cathedral. And it was here, at the highest point in the city, that an artist sat and sketched. What Peter Stern described in words, he recorded in pictures. The sketches the Viennese artist made formed a unique document that portrays all the horrors of the siege.
This view, which is now in the possession of the Vienna Museum here, is undoubtedly one of the main sources of information we have of the first Turkish siege of 1529. I almost said pictorial sources, but that would have been rather limiting.
The attacks and the pillaging outside its gates, just like events inside the city, captured in a single picture.
Eine Darstellung, die den Kampf einer noch mittelalterlichen Stadt gegen eine
The Ottoman siege of 1529 should also be seen as the confrontation between what was still a medieval city and a totally different social order. On the one hand, there was Western Christianity, and on the other, the Islam of the Ottomans with its supreme civilizational quality. Its level of knowledge in so many fields demanded total respect.
Mit einem Können, mit einer Wissenschaft, die
compared with this was the Western system, which was in a state of upheaval. Its intellectual capacity for acknowledging and absorbing other influences was not as advanced at this time as that of the Turks.
Noch nicht so weit ist, wie es zu dieser Zeit die Osmanen gewesen sind.
In Vienna, all the church clocks were stopped. And apart from the little Primglocke of St. Stephen's Cathedral, all the bells in the city ceased to chime throughout the siege. Time stood still. The decision to fight was stylized by Peter Stern as a kind of oath of Vienna. Noble and common companions at arms swore to remain in the city by its magnificent guns as long as there was still life in their bodies, and to die alongside one another for the Christian faith. But the soldiers who took an oath here were mercenaries in the service of the Habsburgs. They were not holy warriors ready to die for their faith. The battle began. As they advanced, the Turks had been forced to leave their heavy wall-breaching guns behind, so they had to bombard Vienna with smaller cannon. These smaller cannon posed little threat to the walls of Vienna. Danger came in the form of the cannonballs that flew into the town. They bounced off the hard paving, causing major damage. So the people of Vienna tore up their streets. Afterwards, the cannonballs merely sank into the soft earth. But the Turks had experience in besieging fortresses like Vienna. The cannon were intended merely to spread fear and prevent the inhabitants from gaining any respite. Meanwhile, the Turks were focusing on their real weapon, In ditches and tunnels, they worked their way towards the city in order to ignite explosive charges beneath the walls of the fortress. At first, the people of Vienna had no idea why the Turks were digging. Unsuspectingly, they sat in their town waiting for an attack which had already begun underground. The principle was to excavate a large chamber at the end of each tunnel and fill it with gunpowder. Each chamber would then be sealed with a wall to attain maximum compression and to protect Turkish troops from the backfire from the blast. Slowly and inexorably, the Turks worked their way towards the city. With every hour of every day, the threat grew. While the teams of excavators were driving their shafts further and further forwards, in the area around Vienna, a tragedy was unfolding. The Akinci were still spreading terror. Their main weapon was the bow. Because of their perfect mastery of it, the Akinci were feared throughout Europe. They even posed a threat to knights in armor.
They waited until their adversary raised his sword, then fired an arrow in here, or through his visor. They could fire so accurately from a galloping horse that they aimed at the slit in the helmet. To the European way of thinking, that was more a perfidious weapon than a knightly one.
The bows of the Turks were high-tech weapons that could withstand high levels of tension. So despite their handy size, they had tremendous penetrative power. However, they were not easy to use.
Actually, it took years and years of practice to fire these historic bows with speed and precision. A troop of musketeers could be recruited and trained very quickly, but you needed years to become an accomplished archer.
What astonished and frightened Europeans most of all was the ability of the Turks to fire at their adversaries from a horse at full gallop.
When a horse is galloping, there's a phase when it has all four hooves off the ground at once, and that's when you have to fire. If you don't, the jolt, when the hooves hit the ground again, will send your arrow flying off at a tangent.
The Akinci plundered the hinterland within a radius of nearly 100 kilometers. The fate of the farmers was a terrible harbinger of what also appeared to await the inhabitants of Vienna. Only rarely did the survivors manage to find refuge in the city, usually under cover of darkness. In his chronicle, Peter Stern recorded that people were butchered in their thousands or abducted. Babies were slit from their mothers' wombs and cast away or impaled. Maidens were violated until they died. May the Almighty have mercy on their souls. And may the murders committed by these cruel bloodhounds not go unavenged. What Peter Stern wrote about the murdering, pillaging Akinci was to shape Europe's image of the Turks for centuries.
That's a very typical quote. The word bloodhound was used for 2 or 3 centuries. The image of impaled infants is one found on very many Turk prints. They were the newspapers of the day, so to speak. Woodcuts were made of scenes in which people tried to depict the barbarity of the Turks, and one highly popular motif was that of infants who had been skewered either on pails or on lances. So this image of the still unripe fruit being ripped from its mother's body occurs very often. Another highly common motif was the violation of young women, so in this respect the quote is most characteristic.
The atrocities that took place outside Vienna are also confirmed by Ottoman reports. Turk prints spread news of them all over Europe, and that was all many people would discern of the Ottoman Empire. The image was formed of a Turk as someone who was cruel by nature, and this image was fostered by the Christian Church, which saw a threat to its power. One of those who preached vehemently against the Turks was Martin Luther. He saw them as the personification of the Antichrist. Thus be assured that the Turk is the devil's most evil fury against Christianity. We see how he acts as cruelly as if he were the wrathful devil incarnate. In Germany, the Peasants' War had only just ended. Tired of the hardship they had to bear, the peasants had revolted. It was by no means rare at this time to find soldiers, and peasants too, who had resettled in the Ottoman Empire. They had fled from a social system that offered no prospect of advancement.
By comparison, the Ottoman Empire was a very dynamic realm. A peasant could rise to become a pasha or a grand vizier, so it was an attractive place for anyone who was ambitious. You could become someone in the Ottoman Empire far sooner than in the West, and that made it generally appealing. Thus, it wasn't only soldiers who defected. The entire Christian populations of some Greek islands switched allegiance. They'd rather live under the Sultan, they said, than under the Pope. So the threat was on another level, a threat to Western society, to the nobility and the clergy. It was mainly the clergy who reacted. By seizing the opportunity to create an external enemy, they tried to divert attention from internal disputes, like Martin Luther and the division within the Church.
Martin Luther, Spaltung der Kirche abzulenken.
One example of the possibilities for personal advancement in the Ottoman Empire were the Janissaries, the elite troops of the Ottoman army, more than 12,000 in number. As Christian children, aged between 12 and 18, they had been abducted from their families in villages in the Balkans, converted to Islam, and taken into the service of the Ottoman state. A career in the state machinery, including the highest of government offices, lay open to those able to overcome their traumatic experiences. One example of this is the career of Suleiman's most important counselor at this time. Abducted as a child from a village in Albania, Ibrahim Pasha had risen to become the Turkish Grand Vizier. The situation for the people of Vienna seemed forlorn. Then it started to rain. A cold spell, unusually early for the time of year, gave them fresh hope. It rained and rained the whole day, and we hoped the baboons outside our walls would freeze to death. But ill weeds grow apace. In weather like this, an assault was out of the question. The Turkish trenches filled up with water, and the black powder for the explosive charges became soaked. As long as the rain continued to fall, Vienna was safe from attack. Spirits in the Turkish ranks sank to rock bottom. It poured down for 2 whole days. The Ottoman camp was just a sea of mud. Bitter cold day and night. It had become so muddy that for several days many pack animals were unable to lie down and rest day or night. It's impossible to describe how much rain fell. Time was running out for the besieging Turkish army. Winter was approaching sooner than expected. Finally, the rain stopped. Vienna's period of grace was over. The grueling underground war continued. By now, the people of Vienna knew about the underground galleries and explosive charges. In the grey light of dawn, the Landskonets planned to make a sortie and stop the Turks excavating any further. 2,000 men prepared to attack. It was an operation fraught with risk. If the soldiers failed to locate the explosive charges laid by the Turks, Vienna was lost. As if from nowhere, the Landskonets suddenly appeared in the Turkish trenches. The surprised Turks tried to flee, but many were cut down. However, losses among the Landskonets were also high. The Landskonets were unable to find the explosive charges. Yet on their sortie they took one of the Turks prisoner. He was to be put to the question, the euphemistic phrase in those days that meant torture.
The first step consisted of merely showing the delinquent the instruments of torture. In the second stage, instruments like this thumbscrew were applied. It had 2 screws which brought 2 metal plates together. The prisoner's thumbs were placed between the plates and massive pressure exerted by turning the screws. This, of course, was incredibly painful and resulted in the delinquent confessing fairly rapidly.
But the Viennese needed to know quickly where the underground explosive charges had been placed. So the man was immediately subjected to the worst possible torture.
People under the cruelest torture fully realized that they would not survive the ordeal. So they were told by their tormentors that they could get it over with faster by confessing, even if this getting it over with faster meant being killed.
Under torture, the prisoner revealed the Turkish plans. In his account, Peter Stern notes without emotion that when he was put to the question, the man finally admitted that charges had been placed to the right and left of the Corinthian gate. No one had previously had any knowledge of this. When our troops were informed, they filled basins with water and positioned guards. The information obtained from the prisoner was not detailed enough. So now the people of Vienna had to sit in their cellars day and night and keep watch. Water reveals any tremors in the earth long before the human ear detects anything. If any ripples formed on the surface of the water, the soldiers dug right next to the spot. In order to be able to storm the city, the Turks wanted to set off an enormous explosive charge to make the city wall collapse. The Turks worked at several points simultaneously, often simply to confuse the enemy. But the Viennese managed to locate the Turkish explosive charges. Now time was of the essence. Lanzknechts were assembled at the threatened sections of the city wall. Final preparations for detonation. Charges of black powder were rolled into the subterranean chambers. The Turkish general attack was imminent. The breach blown in the wall was 30 meters wide. But the Viennese were ready. Positioned in the gap were Lanzknechts, and the Turks ran straight onto their pikes. Beaten, the Janissaries retreated into the Turkish camp. Commanders there received news of the unexpected defeat with dismay. After afternoon prayers, an explosive charge was detonated. Some of the infidels fought in the breach it had created. A fierce battle developed. But because the breach was not wide enough, we could not take the city. The Turkish officers argued as to the further course of action. The Ottoman army was at the end of its tether. The troops were demoralized and had hardly anything left to eat. Even rebellion by the Janissaries could no longer be ruled out. The shortage of food was a matter of serious concern. So the commanders decided to mount a final attack. If the fortress did not succumb, the army would return home. The final assault. Suleiman planned to storm the city in 3 columns. But this time too, the Janissaries ran straight into the pikes and halberds of the Lansquenets. The carnage lasted 2 hours. Then the Turkish soldiers chose of their own accord to retreat. They no longer had the stomach for fighting. They no longer believed they would win the battle. As yet, the Viennese did not dare to believe in their triumph. They still had no idea that the siege was over. In his account, Peter Stern wrote, "The enemy mounted a fierce assault, but this storm soon abated. Enemy losses amounted to some 350 dead. On our side, just 1 Hispanic was shot and numerous Lansquenets were wounded. Praise the Lord." The danger was over, but fear still coursed through the city. The day after the final assault, 3 men were seized. Under torture, they confessed to being Turkish spies. Suleiman, they said, had commissioned them to set fire to the city at 5 points. He had then planned to attack the burning city, while its inhabitants were preoccupied with dousing the flames. The 3 baggage servants who came into the city and who turned out to be Turkish spies were quartered in public, and their body parts hung over the city walls. But the men were probably innocent. Their execution pure hysteria.
There's no doubt that this was also something the people needed. After all, they'd had to withstand the siege, sitting around in their cellars. So it was most certainly a case of thirsting for vengeance when someone was executed like this.
Quartering was a particularly brutal and dishonorable punishment. Through being torn apart, the body could no longer be resurrected.
In depriving a person of the possibility of entering paradise, it wasn't only his body that was being punished, but his soul as well. And in those days, people believed firmly in the hereafter.
The campaign ended for the Ottoman army just as it had begun, in rain and mud. The account by the Ottoman chronicler gives no indication of how many Turkish soldiers starved or froze to death on the march home. The fate of the writer himself is also unknown. It rained incessantly from dawn to dusk. Some of the soldiers lost their entire equipment in the endless deluge, and some of their horses sank in the mire. The suffering was indescribable. As an eastern outpost, Vienna would live in constant danger for the next 150 years. Only after the second unsuccessful siege in 1683 did the Ottoman Empire fall into decline. That same winter, Niklas Meldemann made his way back to Nuremberg. His account gave the world the picture of Viennese resistance to the Islamic Turkish peril. This formed Europe's image of the Turks, and also gave rise to the concept of Vienna as Europe's Christian bulwark.
And next week at the same time we look at the sack of Magdeburg, a horror that left its mark on Europe's conscience for a long time. After the break we join the Royal Regiment of Scotland as they prepare for duty in Afghanistan and look at the heritage of the Scots at war.